Good morning, vinyl community. I'm going to read out some more Poisoner in Chief. It's the second part of the chapter called Abolishing Consciousness. Gottlieb and his CIA comrades were hardly the only Americans who believed during 1953 that the world was facing apocalypse. Many others agreed. MKUltra was conceived and launched as Americans were succumbing to deep fears. The period up until 1954 was a wild and woolly time at the CIA. One retired CIA officer recalled decades later, it was the old OSS mentality. Go out and do it. Doesn't matter if it's good or a bad idea, go do it. We're at war, just anything is justified. We're smarter than most people, we operate in secret. We have access to intelligence, and we know what the real threats are. No one else does. The espionage saga of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg during those months, their trial and conviction on charges of stealing nuclear secrets for the Soviet Union, shook the nation. Early in 1953, they appealed for stays of execution. President Eisenhower refused. So did the Supreme Court. The Rosenbergs were executed on June 19th. Their case fed a terrifying sense that enemies had penetrated American inner sanctums. At the same time, new dangers were used to be emerging abroad. Americans were told that their country was battling the Soviet Union for survival and that the battle was not going well. You can look around the whole circle of the world, John Foster Dulles asserted shortly before taking office as Secretary of State in 1953. And you find one spot after another, where the question is, are we going to lose this part of the world? The new Eisenhower administration, guided by the Dulles brothers, saw urgent threats emerging from the defiant Third World. A leftist government had been elected in Guatemala. Rebels in Vietnam were intensifying their campaign against the French colonial regime. Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh of Iran had nationalized his country's oil reserves. These challenges to Western power were portrayed in the United States not as symptoms of raising nationalism in the developing world, but as coordinated salvos in Moscow's war of global conquest. As the crises in Guatemala, Vietnam, and Iran intensified, an anti-communist uprising broke out in East Berlin. Workers seized government buildings. When local police refused to intervene, Soviet tanks did the dirty work. Leaders of the uprising were arrested, tried, and executed. Americans were told that this would be their fate if communists continued its march. Another episode that shocked the CIA was kept secret. In late 1952, two ICA aviators, John Downey and Richard Fechtow, were captured after being shot down while on a clandestine mission over China. The Red Chinese offered to release them if the United States would admit publicly that they had been working with the CIA. Eisenhower refused, and the two aviators languished in prison until President Richard Nixon finally admitted the truth 2 decades later. So Eisenhower let them slam in the slammer for 2 decades. The Red Chinese offered to release them if the United States would admit publicly that they had been working with the CIA. Eisenhower refused, and the two aviators languished in prison until President Richard Nixon finally admitted the truth 2 decades later. At the CIA, minds ran wild as officers imagined the exotic tortures to which Chinese interrogators must be subjecting their two prisoners. The falsely presumed that the Chinese were doing what themselves were doing, using prisoners of subjects for grotesque drug and mind control experiments. The fighting events confirmed that the existential dread that led Alan Dulles, Richard Helms, and Sidney Gottlieb to justify the extremes of MKUltra, the narrative of encircled and imminent danger that Americans were fed with distant from reality, but it has seized hearts in Washington and had profound effects. In its collective mindsets, the CIA was convinced itself that it was waging a purely defensive war. It justified all of its projects, even though that caused immense pain to individuals and nations, as necessary to block communists' relentless expansion. At the same time, Alan Dulles set MKUltra in motion. He was also preparing several other covert operations that would have earth-shattering effects. He sent the chief of the Tehran station $1 million for use in any way that would bring about the fall of Mossadegh. And by August, his men had deposed the Iranian prime minister in the first CIA coup. Immediately, he began planning to duplicate the feat in Guatemala. He also expanded the CIA station to Vietnam and intensified operations aiming at fomenting anti-Soviet uprisings in Eastern Europe. In his mind, these projects all fit together. MKUltra was just as integral part of the Dulles secret war as any plot against a foreign government. Even as mind control experiments reached new extremes and their human toll began to rise, none of the CIA officers familiar with MKUltra is known to have raised any objection. The CIA's partners in the Special Operations Division, however, were part of the Chemical Corps and therefore under Army command. Senior officers at the Pentagon were intensely interested in LSD and other chemicals that they believed would become weapons of war. They had done more desire to limit or curtail experiments than did their CIA counterparts. Worthwhile results, they told Secretary of Defense Charles Wilson in one memo, could not be obtained unless human volunteers were utilized. Wilson came from a civilized background. He had run General Motors before taking over the Pentagon and sought restraint. He wanted assurances that human subjects in drug experimentations were truly volunteers and not given informed consent as required by the Nuremberg Code. Why wasn't the Nuremberg Code written into American law? In mid-1953, he issued a secret directive requiring that before any military unit conduct an experiment on human beings, both the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of the relevant service must be informed in writing. The rule was more honored in the breach than the observance. Some military units were told of it only orally. Others never heard of it. During the early 1950s, the Secretary of the Army received at least 6 requests to authorize experiments on human volunteers. During the same period, however, the Army Special Operations Division was working with Gottlieb on many other experiments that, under the Wilson Memorandum, should have been reported. As far as is known, none was. The Special Operations Division was an invaluable MKUltra partner. The scientists compounded chemicals that CIA officers administered to the prisoners in special interrogation, successions at secret prisons around the world. Some of them also worked with the CIA's technical services staff to develop gadgets that field agents could use to carry out drug attacks. Much of the science behind them came from experiments on human subjects. SOD, the Special Operations Division, developed darts coated with biological agents and pills containing several different biological agents which could remain potent for weeks or months. Senate investigators later reported SOD also developed a special gun for firing darts coated with a chemical which would allow CIA agents to incapacitate a guard dog, enter an installation security, and return the dog to consciousness when leaving. SOD scientists were unable to develop a similar incapacitant for humans, but they know how to do it to dogs. Americans should have been able to celebrate the release of 7,200 soldiers from communist prisons after an armistice ending the fighting in Korea in July of '53. Instead, they recoiled in shock. Many prisoners, it turned out, had written statements criticizing the United States or praising communism. Some had confessed to committing war crimes. 21 chose to stay behind in North Korea or China. The Pentagon announced that they were considered deserters and would be executed if found. Most astonishing of all, several pilots among the released prisoners asserted that they had dropped bioweapons from their warplanes, contradicting Washington's fierce insistence that they had never deployed such weapons. The most used germ bomb was a 500-pounder, one pilot reported. Each had several compartments to hold different kinds of germs. Insects like fleas and spiders were kept separate from rats and voyles. These allegations set off a new burst of denials from Washington. Gottlieb, as chief of the chemical division, was commissioned to prepare a press pack to refute them. In it, he acknowledged independent experts, both of whom were Gottlieb's friends, wrote that believing the Americans had used germ warfare in Korea was equivalent to believing that flying saucers had landed. How could American soldiers have turned their backs on duty and sullied their country's honor? A stunned nation struggled for explanation. Times examined the defectors' background and concluded that poor upbringing or emotional problems explained their behavior. Newsweek described them as shifty-eyed and groveling. And they said they had betrayed their country in exchange for better treatment because they had fallen in love with Asian women or because of the appeal of homosexualism. Several commentators warned that they represented the weakening of American masculinity and its replacement by a generation of pampered kids and mama's boys. I'd like to see him say that to Charlie Manson. Beyond the nation's spiritual decline and the feminization of its men, another theory quickly emerged: brainwashing. In the 3 years since the propagandist Edward Hunter had invented the term, it had become the last resort explanation for everything inexplicable. In the minds of most Americans, nothing was more inexplicable than any of their strapping young men to decide that living under communism could be better than living in the United States. Brainwashing was the easiest and most obvious explanation. The headline over the article of the New Republic crystallized American fears. Communist brainwashing. Are we prepared? The shocking behavior of American prisoners convinced many Americans that brainwashing existed and become part of the communist arsenal. Another aspect of the prisoners' return was not made public, intensified fears within the CIA. Interrogations of the individuals who had come out of North Korea across the Soviet Union to freedom recently had apparently a blank period or period of disorientation while passing through a special zone in Manchuria. A CIA officer wrote in a memo to the Special Operations Division, this had occurred to all individuals in a party after they had their first full meal and first coffee. Drugging was indicating. There was no more evidence of this than there was brainwashing. Inside the CIA and other security agencies in Washington, however, these reports were taken as further proof that communist scientists ahead of their Western counterparts in the race to discover and deploy psychoactive drugs. They also, for the first time, connected the name Manchuria with mind control, a connection which would soon burst into public consciousness. In the years after fighting ended in Korea, most of the American defectors trickled home. Several spoke about their captivity. None reported that they had been subjected to any pressure that could be described as brainwashing. Their decision to defect was a result of individual combinations of anger and the inequities of American life, desire for adventure, the traditional forms of coercion. In the conformist America of that era, through brainwashing was a magnificently convenient explanation for every form of human behavior that they did not understand. The CIA fell hard for this fantasy. This is ample evidence in the reports of innumerable interrogations that the communists were utilizing drugs, physical duress, electric shock, and possibly hypnosis against their enemies. The chief of the CIA's medical staff wrote in a memo that reflected the panic of the moment. With such evidence, it is difficult not to keep from becoming rabid about our apparent laxity. We are focused more on this mounting evidence to assume a more aggressive role in the development of these techniques. So we will end here and continue on in another day. We want to thank all the vinyl members and crime scene members. If you like my stream at all, please like and share.